Coming up next on IGI, a discussion with author, historian, and one of America's leading anti-racist voices, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Stay with us.
KNEA, empowering educators so that educators can empower Kansas students.
This program is brought to you with support from the Lewis H. Humphreys Charitable Trust and from the Friends of KTWU.
Hello and welcome to IGI. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Beatty. Our guest today is a National Book Award-winning author and is here to discuss How to Be an Anti-Racist, which also happens to be the title of his latest book. Dr. Ibram X. Kendi is a professor at American University in Washington, D.C., where he teaches history and international relations and is the founding director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. Dr. Kendi won the National Book Award in 2016 for his book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. Now here's a quote from Dr. Kendi's new book. "We know how to be racist. We know how to pretend to be not racist. Now let's know how to be anti-racist." So on that quote, let's welcome our guest, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Thanks so much for joining us here.
Oh, it's great to be on the show.
Yeah, I'd like to start going back a bit. Tell us a bit about your background and, if you can, a little bit about your journey toward writing the books you've written, including your newest one.
So I was born and raised in Jamaica, Queens, from parents who were in the civil rights and Black Power movements, who largely raised me into the church and largely also showed me that racism was a problem. I ultimately went and got my PhD in African American Studies, and my second book was a history of racist ideas in America. And I didn't just want to sort of chronicle the history of anti-Black racist ideas. I wanted to chronicle the types of ideas that were challenging those ideas. And I found that each of those people who were producing racist ideas were typically classifying their ideas and themselves as not racist. And so I knew that I couldn't necessarily identify those ideas and those peoples as not racist, since that's how they were defining themselves. And so that's when I used the term anti-racist, and I really chronicled the history of racist and anti-racist ideas. And the more I spoke about that book, which was entitled Stamped from the Beginning, the more people were like, oh, tell me a little bit more about how to be anti-racist, because I've been taught how to be not racist, but I really want to know more about how to be anti-racist, which is ultimately what led me to write this new book.
Now, what's interesting is that in your book, you do talk about personal stories, about growing up, and you actually say in the book that you look back and you see a different person than you are now, or you see things that you did that we wouldn't do now. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I grew up and I came of age in the 1990s, and I was a Black youngster in the 1990s. And if there was ever a decade in American history when Americans, including Black Americans, including older Black Americans in particular, but white Americans, Americans more broadly, were saying that one of the fundamental racial problems was Black youth. It was the 1990s. And so that was the time which apparently Black girls were apparently having too many babies, Black boys were, quote, super predators, Black children or youth did not value education. And I ended up believing and consuming these racist ideas about Black people. And I ended up basically sharing them in a speech as a senior in high school that really opens this book, and which really sort of showed just how deep and widespread these ideas that there was something wrong with Black people, that even somebody who was Black was believing them.
And if I'm correct, you initially thought you might be a sports writer. Is that true? So how do you, what happened where you broke away and said, you know, I don't think I'm going to be a sports writer. I think I'll go into academia and maybe the more realm of the ideas. How did that process?
So I grew up, I wanted to play basketball. I actually did play basketball, but at some point I realized I probably wouldn't make the NBA. So I felt that I could sort of write a little bit, and so I decided, well, let me go about being a sports writer. And the more that I sort of interned and really sort of engaged in that craft, the more I got to meet sort of famous athletes, the more I realized that they breathed the same air that I did, and you know, these were just normal people, and it wasn't as interesting to me as I got closer to it. But at the same time, racial battles and issues were becoming more and more interesting to me, and ultimately I found that I could make a difference by writing about and speaking about racism.
Yeah, let's talk about your new book. It's getting a lot of attention already and just came out this year. We'll start out simply, then we'll branch out, because for me and others, and I think other people have told you this, they're grappling with these ideas, some of which you're presenting. So can you present to the audience, what's some of the main arguments of your book? You've already mentioned them, but what are you imparting through your newest book?
Well, I think first and foremost, I want people to realize that there are really only two types of ideas, racist and anti-racist ideas. There's only two types of policies, racist and anti-racist policies. And people are either being racist or anti-racist, and that this construct of not racist has always really been a term of denial, that slaveholders imagined themselves as not racist, just as white nationalists today imagine themselves as not racist, that it really doesn't have any meaning other than for ones to deny one's own racism. But there's a very clear meaning when someone says a racist idea. In other words, someone is saying there's something superior or inferior about a racial group, or an anti-racist idea. When someone is saying there's nothing superior or inferior about any of the racial groups, the racial groups are equal, or a racist policy, which is leading to racial inequity, or an anti-racist policy, which is leading to equity. And people are either expressing and supporting either racist or anti-racist ideas. And when they're expressing or supporting racist ideas or policies, they're being racist. When they're expressing anti-racist ideas or supporting anti-racist policies, they're being anti-racist.
So I think where people are struggling with this, and you are getting quite a bit of credit from what I've seen for putting it out there, putting out these ideas out there for people to discuss. But for some people it's uncomfortable because I think, as you're alluding to, there's no middle area. No. And so there are all types of people from all races who respond to, if they're called racist or something, they, as you know, they will say, literally, though there's not a racist bone in my body, or the classic, oh, I have many friends from this race or that race. And you're saying that that's not really valid. Is that correct?
Yeah, because I think we've been taught that a racist is essential to who a person is. And that literally it's like a fixed category. And it's not something that we can see. In other words, you can't literally see someone's heart or bones. But in fact, you can see or hear what someone says. You can see what policies they're supporting or not supporting. And what people do, what people say, are a reflection of what they're being in that moment. And I think that's how we need to define the term racist and anti-racist, as not essentially bad person racist, good person anti-racist, and not look for what they're saying and what they're doing. Fundamentally, if a person is saying there's something wrong with black people, or if a person is supporting a policy that's leading to racial inequity, then they're being racist. And typically, though, historically and today, when people are charged with being racist, they view it as an attack as opposed to a descriptive term. In other words, a person is describing what they're saying or doing. And the reason why they view it as an attack is because they feel like it's a fixed category, that I essentially will be a racist for the rest of my life if I acknowledge, as an anti-racist would, that I just said something that's racist.
What about former Alabama Governor George Wallace, who, was the king of segregation, but later, in his later years, reached out to African Americans? I mean, was somebody like that actually near the end of his life seeing racism as something that can be changeable? I mean, or is that a bad example?
Well, I think it's a good example. I mean, I think whenever George Wallace, in the latter part of his life, was rejecting his earlier ideas, that the races need to be separated, that white people are superior. And whenever he was saying that essentially there's nothing superior about white people or inferior about black people and the racial groups are equals and I'm going to support, meaning if he was saying publicly he's going to support desegregation policies or anti-racist policies that are leading to racial equity, whenever he was saying that, he was being anti-racist, despite what he did in the past. And the reason why this is critical is because you've had Americans who have said both racist and anti-racist ideas, who support both racist and anti-racist policies. In other words, when it comes to healthcare, they support anti-racist policies. But then when it comes to criminal justice, they support racist policies. Or when it comes to education, they support racist policies. And so because people are so complex and even contradictory, and depending on the issue or the context, they're being racist or anti-racist, that's why we can't essentially pigeonhole someone. And also because people have the capacity to change, we have to recognize this as essentially identifying people based on what they're doing in the moment.
Yeah, I think this is a really important idea. Look at somebody like the former Seinfeld actor Michael Richards. He had a racist rant, as you may know, at one of his stand-ups, and he's still haunted by this. I mean, so this idea that maybe even he himself thinks it's an immutable concept, whereas this idea is kind of liberating. You're saying that no, it doesn't. It's not necessarily a personality trait. It's something that each individual can deal with and be anti-racist if they work at it.
Yes, but what's critical is no one just wakes up one day and decides that they're anti-racist. That literally it's something that we have to work out and work on almost every day. To give an example, I like to compare being anti-racist to almost like overcoming an addiction, in which in many ways we are raised in this country to be racist. We are raised to look out at all of these disparities in our country and not see racist policies, but see what's wrong with people. We're constantly thinking about what's wrong with this or right about this racial group. We're constantly trying to civilize this racial group and judge this other racial group from our own personal standards. Whenever we're raised and taught to be like that. And in many ways, our country has been filled with inequities from the time in which we were all born. And so literally, you can't just wake up one day and be like, I'm not going to think any of those ideas anymore. Just as like an alcoholic can't just wake up one day and say, I'm freed of alcoholism. It's literally an everyday process to try to overcome our upbringing.
So another interesting idea in your writing is that, and there's been some comments on this in reaction to your book. People have said they always believe in this idea of America as the melting pot, and they were the assimilation was good, and they weren't racist because they believed people could assimilate. And you reject this idea of assimilation. How do you view that?
So typically, those who were assimilationists standardized their own culture, and particularly, let's say, white American culture. So they standardized their culture, and in making it the standard, judged it to be superior to other cultures. And so it wasn't a melting pot as much as everyone else essentially being ordered or urged to basically become white from a cultural perspective because there was something apparently wrong with their culture. And so anytime we're suggesting that there's something wrong with a particular racial group's culture, or even right with a particular racial group's culture, and anytime we're promoting policies that essentially allow for the reinforcing of one culture and the elimination of another, we are being racist. Now, I think that what's critical is Americans have never been able to figure out whether we want a single culture or whether we want a multicultural nation. And I think in many ways we've been arguing over what type of country we want. And anti-racists advocate for a multicultural nation in which all the cultures are valued equally.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. The contradictions like Americans who value independence, and yet when somebody does something that's incredibly independent, like a Colin Kaepernick, they get terrible that criticism. So I do see that there's this constant conflict about, is it multi or is it a single culture? There's a term that you use or have used, metastatic racism. Can you tell us more about that, or the ideas behind that?
Sure. So last year I had metastatic cancer. And in many ways, in writing this book, while I was also fighting metastatic cancer, and I began to see the similarities between basically cancer and racism. And I began to see the way in which the American body and the American bodies are affected with metastatic racism. And I also began to see that many Americans are denying that they have racism, that their nation has racism, which is only causing the symptoms to get worse. And we see those symptoms every day in our headlines, which is only making it harder for Americans to heal themselves of that racism. And I also found that the way we treat metastatic cancer is actually the way we can treat metastatic racism. That typically with metastatic cancer, you have a local and a systemic treatment. A local treatment in which you go in and surgically remove what would be racist policies, because you see those as tumors, you see those as bad for the body politic. But then doctors also do a systemic treatment in which they flood the body with chemotherapy, which is essentially like flooding the body with anti-racist policies, which essentially reduce racial inequity and prevent the reoccurrence of racial inequity. And so we can be essentially treating racism as we treat cancer. But one of the reasons why we don't is because it's painful. And anyone going through cancer treatment knows how painful it is. And somehow Americans want to heal this country of racism and not go through any pain.
Is it painful because as we've been talking about, it's this idea that it may be a personal failing? Is that why some people think
I think so.
Painful?
Yeah, and
because they don't want to admit to themselves that they might have been fooling themselves for a long time, thinking they weren't?
I mean, just like when I was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, it was extremely hard for me to admit that I had cancer. You know, I was 36 years old, had no risk factors. It was unbelievable. And so I think from that standpoint, you have many Americans who just don't want to admit that they have such a serious illness because they don't see any risk factors, right? But then also because of how they conceive of the term racist. Mm-hmm. They view a racist as a bad person, fundamentally. And I've just chronicled in my research so many good Americans who actually have been people who have been racist. To give an example, probably there were many abolitionists who, on the one hand, were great people for challenging slavery, for calling for immediate emancipation, when many Americans were calling for gradual emancipation or even permanent slavery. But at the same time, some of these abolitionists were also saying that slavery is so bad and so evil, it has literally dehumanized black people. In other words, slavery has made black people into brutes. In other words, black people are no longer human. Mm-hmm. In other words, white people are superior to black people because of the ravages of slavery. And so therefore, when the Civil War came and emancipation came, some of these same abolitionists were like, these people need to be civilized first before they get their political and civil rights. And so clearly when they were challenging slavery, they were being anti-racist. But then when they were not championing, when they were imagining that enslaved black people were brutes, or that we weren't deserving of our civil and political rights, they were being racist.
In your book, you have a quote that I found, and you write this: "This book is ultimately about the basic struggle we're all in, the struggle to be fully human and to see that others are fully human." Unquote. That's actually a very optimistic, I think, statement, in that you see that if we recognize the humanness of each other, there's a way out of this cycle of racism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most destructive elements of racism is not just the ways in which it's created all of these disparities and inequities in our country, but also it's literally separated human from human. It's caused people to view differences, whether that's cultural differences or even skin color differences, as essentially distinct from them from a humane standpoint. In other words, that person is just not like me, not a human like me. Or it hasn't allowed people to really be able to embrace the breadth of humanity. Because when you think about the breadth of humanity, the beauty of humanity, that beauty is in its diversity. And if people are only sort of embracing their own branch of the entire tree, they're not connected to the rest of the tree. And they're not allowing that tree to continue to grow.
You spoke at a conference that involved mascots and sports teams, and then we've also had the issue of the Confederate statues. I don't necessarily expect you to have the answer to this, but we see people really clinging hard to a mascot that may, be pretty clearly racist, or a statue that really brings about some terrible feelings among people. What do you think is going on that some people are almost desperate to keep that mascot or that name when it can hurt, so many people?
Because I think in the case of the mascot, they care more about their own feelings. They're deeply connected to the Redskins. They have all this Redskins paraphernalia. They grew up a, quote, Redskins fan. They can't imagine being connected to that team and not being a Redskin, right? And so they're thinking more about their own personal feelings than the racial slur that is the name of their team. And I think they're dismissing it as, oh, what's the big deal, right? Because they're thinking about it not from the perspective of the Native community, but from their own perspective. And I think in terms of Confederate statues, I think we unfortunately, particularly Southerners and even Americans, have not been taught Southern history. And I think in a mass and accurate way. I mean, Southern history, like American history, is deeply politicized. And even if we go back to the time of the Confederacy, it's actually an open question whether the majority of white Southerners even were supportive of the Confederacy. You can actually make a case that the majority of white Southerners were against the Confederacy, did not want to go to the, quote, rich man's war, rioted during the Civil War because they weren't getting any food, fled the Confederate Army, joined with enslaved Africans to wage slave revolts, hoped that the Confederacy would not succeed, or that the Southern states would not succeed for the Union, hoped that they would rejoin the Union. We don't actually know whether the majority of white Southerners actually supported the Confederacy. We know that almost half of the South was black and they didn't support the Confederacy. So this idea that somehow the Confederacy, or I should say, honoring sort of Confederate monuments or even the flag is honoring Southern pride is actually historically in question. And I think you can actually make an argument that the Confederacy did not represent the South. They certainly did not represent those 5 million poor non-slave holding whites in 1860, and they certainly did not represent black people when the vice president of the Confederacy said in 1862 that this new government was based on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man and that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition.
We only have a few more minutes. What are your thoughts? Are they optimistic or despondent about the current political situation in the United States? In some ways there's reactions and then reactions to reactions, but what about the Obama years and then what has followed? And are you hopeful that by starting this kind of discussion and a lot more that's going on in the United States that the progress can be made?
Well, one thing I do know is that in order for progress to be made, the people have to believe that progress is possible. And so essential to doing the hard work of making progress is having hope. is believing that change is possible. And so for me, I am personally always grabbing and garnering and sort of drawing from the well of hope by looking at those people on the ground from Topeka to where I live in Washington, D.C., who are seeking to bring about change, because they are the hope that I think will continue to guide us, and they are literally bringing about this sort of change.
And we have a little over a minute, but there's people watching, reading your book that I think are looking inward, looking at themselves, and hopeful. So what would you say to them, maybe just repeating what you said, but what are you saying to them that they can do maybe to be the change that they want to be?
Well, I think it's critical for us to be anti-racist. And what that means to me is to literally view the racial groups as equals, be part of the campaigns and struggles in your community that is challenging racist policies, that is seeking to replace it with anti-racist policies, that's literally trying to create equal opportunity for all. Like every individual, every one of us can be a part of that struggle.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And again, I would encourage people to read your book and think about the ideas that you're setting forward. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on.
That's all the time we have for this episode of IGI. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, send us an email at issues@ktw.org. If you'd like to view this program again or any previous episodes of IGI, visit us online at watch.ktw.org. For IGI, I'm Dr. Bob Beatty. Thanks for watching.
KNEA, empowering educators so that educators can empower Kansas students.
This program is brought to you with support from the Lewis H. Humphreys Charitable Trust and from the Friends of KTWU.